Mark Davidson had always been drawn to the unusual. His new apartment in downtown Chicago was a blank canvas, and he was determined to furnish it with one-of-a-kind finds. That's how he ended up scrolling through the free section of an online classified site late one evening. Among the typical listings, used couches, broken appliances, one ad caught his eye. Antique mirror, free to a good home. The photo attached to the ad showed an ornate full-length mirror with an intricately carved wooden frame. It was beautiful, almost regal, and certainly worth more than the free price tag. The description below was brief. Must pick up today. Please do not contact unless serious. It needs to be gone before nightfall. The urgency intrigued Mark. He tapped the number and sent a quick message. Is the mirror still available? I can pick it up tonight. The reply came almost instantly. Yes. Please come now. 187 Willow Street. The address was in an old part of town, not far from where Mark lived. Something about the rushed tone of the message unsettled him, but he shrugged it off. A free antique mirror was too good to pass up. Half an hour later, Mark pulled up to a dilapidated Victorian house. The lawn was overgrown and the windows were dark. For a moment, he considered turning back. But before he could decide, the door creaked open, and an elderly woman stepped out, her silhouette framed by the dim porch light. "You're here for the mirror," she said, her voice shaky but urgent. Mark nodded. "Yeah, it looks beautiful. Why are you giving it away?" The woman hesitated, her hands wringing together. It doesn't belong here. It needs to go. Tonight." Mark frowned. "What do you mean?" She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped aside, motioning for him to follow. Inside, the house was cold and smelled faintly of mildew. The mirror stood in the center of the living room, covered by a heavy cloth. The woman pulled the cloth away, revealing the mirror in all its grandeur. The frame was even more intricate up close, with carvings that seemed to writhe and twist under the dim light. "It's beautiful," Mark said, though he couldn't shake the feeling that the carvings were watching him. The woman grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Take it and go, but whatever you do, don't look into it after midnight." "Why not?" Mark asked, half laughing. Her face darkened. "Just promise me, please." Mark nodded, uneasy but eager to leave. He loaded the mirror into his car, waved a quick goodbye, and drove off. Back at his apartment, Mark set the mirror against the wall in his bedroom. It was a perfect fit, adding an air of sophistication to the otherwise sparse room. He admired his reflection for a moment, adjusting his hair. "Not bad," he said to himself with a grin. By the time he went to bed, the strange warning from the old woman was all but forgotten. But as the clock struck midnight, Mark woke with a start. His bedroom was dark, save for a faint glow coming from the mirror. He sat up, squinting at the glass. The reflection was wrong. The room it showed wasn't his own. It was the same size and layout, but the walls were bare, the furniture gone, and in the corner of the reflected room, something moved. Mark's breath caught as a figure stepped into view. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by shadow. The figure stood perfectly still, staring at him through the glass. "Hello?" Mark whispered, his voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, mimicking his movement. Then it raised a hand and pressed it against the inside of the glass. Mark scrambled for the light, his heart pounding. When the room flooded with light, the figure was gone, and the mirror showed only his own reflection. He sat there for a long moment, trying to steady his breathing. "Just a dream," he muttered. That's all it was. But deep down, he wasn't so sure. Mark couldn't shake the events of the previous night. He stood before the mirror, studying it carefully. In the daylight, it looked ordinary enough, its frame gleaming faintly in the sunlight that filtered through his blinds. But the memory of the shadowy figure lingered, Its image burned into his mind. Just stress, he told himself. I've been working too much. Still, the woman's warning echoed in his thoughts. Why had she been so desperate to get rid of the mirror? Later that day, Mark decided to do some research. He snapped a picture of the mirror and posted it to a local antiques forum, asking if anyone recognized it. Within minutes, replies flooded in. Most were curious or admiring, but one message stood out. Get rid of it. Now. That's the hollow glass mirror. Mark frowned and clicked on the username. The profile belonged to someone named Alan Brenner, whose bio identified him as a retired historian. Intrigued, Mark sent him a direct message. Mark, what's the hollow glass mirror? Do you know anything about it? Alan, more than I want to. Can we talk on the phone? This isn't something to type out. Mark hesitated but sent his number. Moments later, his phone rang. Is this Mark? The voice on the other end asked, shaky and urgent. Yeah, Mark replied. I'm the guy with the mirror. Alan sighed heavily. Listen to me. That mirror, whatever you do, don't look into it at night, and don't keep it in your bedroom. Why not? Mark asked, his pulse quickening. It's cursed, Alan said bluntly. It was made in the late 1800s by a craftsman named Elias Greaves. He was obsessed with the idea of trapping spirits in reflective surfaces. That mirror was his masterpiece. Mark's stomach churned. You're saying it's haunted? It's worse than that, Alan said. The mirror doesn't just reflect, it connects. It shows you things from the other side, and if you're not careful, it lets them in. Mark rubbed his temples, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. You're serious, aren't you? I wish I wasn't, Alan replied. There's a reason that mirror keeps changing hands. Nobody can keep it for long. The last owner before you, she reached out to me a few years ago. She was seeing things in the glass, hearing voices. I told her to destroy it, but she wouldn't listen. Then one day, she disappeared, just gone. Mark swallowed hard. What should I do? Get rid of it, Alan said. Take it somewhere far away, smash it, bury the pieces. But whatever you do, don't keep it in your house. Mark hung up, his mind racing. He turned to the mirror, its surface reflecting his living room. It looked so normal, beautiful even. Could it really be the source of everything he'd experienced? He decided to take Alan's advice. Wrapping the mirror in an old blanket, he carried it down to his car, his nerves on edge. The drive to the outskirts of the city was uneventful, but the air grew heavier the closer he got to his destination, an abandoned quarry where he planned to destroy the mirror. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. Mark parked the car and carried the mirror to the edge of the quarry. As he unwrapped it, the wind picked up, howling through the empty space. For a moment, he hesitated. Could he really destroy something so beautiful? He raised the hammer, his hands trembling, but before he could bring it down, the surface of the mirror rippled. Mark froze, his breath catching in his throat. The reflection had changed. Instead of the quarry, it showed his apartment, as though the mirror was begging him to bring it back. "Stop it," he muttered, shaking his head. "It's just a trick." The glass rippled again, and this time he saw himself in the reflection. But it wasn't him. The figure in the mirror wore his face, but its eyes were black voids, and its lips twisted into a cruel smile. "Don't," the figure said, its voice echoing in his mind. "You need me." Mark stumbled back, dropping the hammer. He clutched his head as the voice grew louder, filling his thoughts with promises and threats. "Without me, you'll be nothing," the figure hissed. "I can give you everything you've ever wanted, power, wealth, love. Just take me back." Mark fell to his knees, shaking. The figure stepped closer in the reflection, its hand reaching toward him through the glass. "No!" Mark shouted, grabbing the hammer. With all his strength, he swung it at the mirror. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, shards flying in every direction. The reflection disappeared, leaving only jagged pieces glittering in the fading light. Mark stumbled away, his breathing ragged. For a moment, the world was silent. Then, from the shadows of the quarry, came a low, guttural laugh. "You think it's over?" a voice whispered, cold and mocking. "You've only just begun." Mark drove home in silence, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. His mind raced as the events at the quarry replayed in his head. He had destroyed the mirror, or so he thought. But the mocking voice and the shadow that lingered in the corners of his vision told a different story. When he finally arrived at his apartment, he hesitated at the door. The air felt heavier, the silence unnaturally loud. Slowly, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The living room was as he'd left it, but the faint metallic tang in the air made his stomach churn. And then he saw it. The mirror was back. It stood exactly where it had before, its frame pristine, its glass untouched. The jagged edges and shards he'd left behind at the quarry were gone, as though the destruction had never happened. Mark's legs gave out, and he sank to the floor. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "This isn't real." The glass rippled, and Mark's reflection appeared, but it wasn't him. It was the other him, the version with hollow black eyes and a twisted smile. "You can't escape me," the reflection said, its voice cold and venomous. "You brought me here. You let me in." Mark scrambled back, his breaths coming in shallow gasps. "What do you want from me?" The figure in the mirror tilted its head, its grin widening. "You, Mark. I want you." Over the next few days, Mark's life unraveled. The reflection didn't just haunt the mirror anymore, it followed him. At night, he would see it in the windows, in the darkened screens of his devices, even in the gleam of his kitchen faucet. It was always there, watching, waiting. Sleep became impossible. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they filled every corner of his apartment. "Mark, join me. You can't run." He tried to reach out for help. Alan's number was the first he called, but it went straight to voicemail. Desperate, Mark drove back to the old Victorian house where he'd first found the mirror. But when he arrived, the house was gone. Nothing but an overgrown lot remained, as if it had never been there in the first place. One night, as the clock struck midnight, Mark reached his breaking point. The whispers had become screams, and the mirror glowed faintly, its surface alive with shifting shadows. "I'm done," Mark said, his voice shaking but resolute. "If you want me, come and get me." The room fell silent. For a moment, even the mirror seemed to hold its breath. Then the glass rippled, and the reflection stepped out. It moved like liquid, its form solidifying as it crossed the threshold. The air grew icy, and Mark felt an overwhelming pressure, as though the weight of the entire room was pressing down on him. The figure smiled. "You invited me," it said, its voice like nails on a chalkboard. Mark backed away, his heart pounding. "What are you?" The figure laughed, a hollow, echoing sound. "I am the other side, Mark, the shadow of every reflection, and now I'm free." The battle was brief and brutal. Mark fought with everything he had, using furniture, lamps, anything within reach to fend off the creature. But it was no use. The thing was stronger, faster, and utterly relentless. In the end, Mark found himself pinned against the wall, the creature's black eyes inches from his own. "Do you see now?" it hissed. "You can't destroy me. You can only replace me." Mark's vision blurred as the creature's hand pressed against his chest. He felt a pull, as if his very soul was being dragged out of his body. "No!" Mark screamed, summoning every ounce of strength he had. He grabbed a shard of glass from the broken coffee table and drove it into the creature's chest. The thing let out a guttural roar, its body convulsing as black smoke poured from the wound. It stumbled back toward the mirror, its form flickering like a dying flame. Mark seized the moment. He grabbed the mirror and threw it to the ground with all his strength. This time, when the glass shattered, it didn't just break, it disintegrated, the shards dissolving into a fine, black mist. The creature let out one final ear-piercing scream before collapsing into the darkness, its form vanishing completely. When the sun rose, Mark's apartment was quiet. The mirror was gone, and with it, the suffocating presence that had plagued him. But the scars remained, on his body, on his mind, and in the faint whispers that still lingered in the back of his thoughts. He left the apartment that day, carrying nothing but a single box of belongings. As he drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. For just a moment, he saw it, the black-eyed version of himself, staring back with a twisted smile. Then it was gone. Mark gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles white. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew one thing for certain. The mirror was only the beginning.